In 5. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's workshop of the Board of Education on August the 12th, 2020. Tonight, Gibson Consulting will be presenting its findings from its performance audit to the Board of Education. This meeting is being televised live on AACPS TV and streamed live on AACPS YouTube channel. If we are interrupted during the broadcast of tonight's meeting, the meeting will be stopped and we will take a short recess until we can continue. If for some reason we cannot, we will notify you as soon as possible when a new meeting will be scheduled. Our board attorney has asked that I read the following statement. The Maryland Open Meetings Act, a state law, requires public meetings to be open to the public and to be, quote, held in places reasonably accessible to individuals who would like to attend these meetings. The virtual format of this workshop of the Board of Education is due to the COVID-19 emergency and is necessary in light of the serious health risks associated with public gatherings, as well as the governor's and county executives' various executive orders limiting public gatherings. While a virtual meeting of this type was not envisioned by the Open Meetings Act, steps have been taken to ensure that this virtual meeting includes alternative accessibility features that the Open Meetings Act Compliance Board and the courts have reviewed and approved broadcasting the meeting with video and audio on cable TV and on the web. The board attorney has opined that the public access provided by this technology makes this virtual meeting reasonably accessible to the public and provides appropriate opportunity to observe the conduct of the board's workshop consistent with prevailing best practices during this emergency situation and therefore complies with the Open Meetings Act. Since we are virtual tonight and we are in workshop format, just a reminder to the folks that we will be receiving our full presentation. After the presentation is complete, we will be going on a roll call order with instructions already provided to the board, going in roll call order if questions are desired to be posed to Gibson Consulting. So at this time, I would like to first start with roll call of the board members. Ms. Ellis.
Present.
Mr. Grannon. Ms. Schallheim.
Present.
Ms. Antwine.
Here.
Mr. Gilliland.
Here.
Mr. Leib.
Here.
Ms. Hummer.
Here.
Mr. Smith.
Here.
Thank you very much. I want to first start the evening off by giving a big hearty thank you on behalf of the Board of Education and myself personally for our internal auditor, Walt. He's joined us this evening, and he has done an outstanding job in ensuring that we have an integritous, benevolent, informative outcome of our audit. I want to thank the County Council and the County Executive for being willing to support this initiative through their funding authority, and all of the patients, of the staff, and of the county, particularly the Office of Budget, who was willing to, along with our members, coordinate and assist in making this audit the most robust and best possible outcomes for all of us. Gibson Consulting, a gracious, much gratitude for all the hard work that you have done to better our students and better Anne Arundel County's students in particular in this matter. I think it speaks droves because our mission is for all of our students, and this is one way through self-examination and through independent methodology to continue our hard work to improve our education system so that our values and our mission to well educate every single student can be recognized and continued. So thank you guys very much for all of your efforts. We have a lot to begin with, and because of some unfortunate technical difficulties and storms on the horizon, We did have to delay by a couple minutes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to our auditor, Walt, if you would like to say a couple words before we get started.
Well, I appreciate your comments regarding my participation, and I know the Gibson group put in a lot of time and effort. I think we coordinated this project fairly well. I have nothing but positive things to say about the group, and I'm anxious to hear their presentation. So thanks to all the participation of Gibson and especially our own staff, because I, at the beginning, was apprehensive about how quickly we'd be able to get the information together that Gibson requested, and the staff did an excellent job of getting all that information together in a quick fashion, and I was able to get it to Gibson as they desired it. So I'm thankful to everyone who participated in this project.
Thank you very much, Walt. And Dr. Alato is also joined us tonight. Thank you very much, Dr. Alato. I know that we could not have had that support that Walt just referred to without your leadership and willingness to support the board in their efforts of supporting you for all that you do each and every single day for our students. So thank you very much, Dr. Alato. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the table over to Gibson. They have a presentation, so we're going to have some slides up on the screen for a period of time, and then we'll go to the next step in our agenda. Gentlemen, ladies, you have the table.
Thank you, Board President Corcadell, members of the board, Dr. Arlotto. It is our pleasure to be here tonight to present you the results of our performance audit. Before we get started, I would like to reiterate some of the thanks that are due. As was stated earlier, it was Wednesday when we were on site when the pandemic was announced. We were very grateful that you allowed us to finish our work that week, and we were also had to, due to some scheduling difficulties that were obvious, we rescheduled some of the activities for subsequent remote. Fortunately, we were equipped to do remote as you were, and so we're very appreciative of the time and the commitment of your staff to this project, and I have more to say about your staff in a little bit. I'd also like to thank Walt. Walt, it's been great to have a liaison that in your role as the head of internal audit to interface with us. This really worked perfectly from our standpoint. I know Carrie shares that sentiment, but I think one of the reasons this project has been successful is because of you, and I'm grateful. So thank you. I'm going to allow my team to introduce themselves. I'm going to be doing the presentation. They may chime in every now and then we will all be available for questions. But I will turn it over to Carrie, who is joining us by phone, so you will not see her face, but she is here, and I'll let her start off with the team introductions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Good evening. This is Carrie Monkwitz, and I too am having audio issues, which is why I'm joining you by telephone. But I served as the project manager for this engagement, and I was also the lead consultant for the assessment of the human resources function throughout this project.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ali Taylan. I was the lead consultant for the information technology section of the report. Very glad to be here.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Kent Ingram. I serve as the lead consultant for the financial management section of this report.
Hello, I'm Dr. Elaine Howard, and I'm a consultant for human resources.
Thank you. In addition to being the project director, I was also the lead consultant for the governance portion of this work, and I also participated in several sections of the financial management chapter. So I'll move on to our agenda for the presentation. I think Bob's going to load it up for us, and we will get started. Bob, if you will proceed to the next slide with the agenda. This is the agenda for the presentation. There's going to be an introduction that's just going to go through kind of an overview, kind of a reintroduction of our firm, overview of the project approach, methodology, and then some of the objective scope approach and major themes of the study. The bulk of our presentation will be the report recommendations that we'll go through each chapter. So first, the introduction. I just wanted to reintroduce the firm. It's been a while since we were introduced to you for the first time. And so I wanted to just share with you some information about us in case you forgot or didn't know. But our mission statement is to better the lives of students by providing exemplary consulting research services that make an educational system more efficient and effective. This is an important mission. We have not always had the word student in our mission statement until about 8 years ago. And so we felt that this was an important addition, that we are committed to the lives of students, much like our clients. We're a consulting and research firm exclusively dedicated to the K-12 industry. That's unusual in the consulting and research industry in our business, but we love it. We haven't always been that way, but we've been that way for most of the last 20 years, and it's done nothing but good things for us. We've conducted more than 150 school system performance audits similar to this nationwide in 27 different states, and we were selected in January 2020 through a competitive procurement to conduct this important performance audit for you. So on the next slide, you'll see our entire team. I won't repeat the names of the individuals that introduced themselves, but there are two other members of our team. Susan Quinn is a subcontractor. She assisted in financial management, and Russ Edwards with Kite Services, also a subcontractor, assisted in risk management. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about just an overview of the project. The project objective, as stated in the RFP, was pretty straightforward: to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of selected AACPS areas and make recommendations for improvement. So the clarity of purpose and simplicity of purpose is always great for a study, and this was a good objective. On the next slide, you'll see the scope of work. There were selected areas. This was not a comprehensive performance audit, as you know. We looked at governance, and under governance, we rolled under board governance, senior administration, which is really part of governance, and then because it was related, senior academic staff was a separate category of work, but we rolled it under the governance portion of the report. And then the other three areas were financial management, human resources, and technology. And we thought it was important that in terms of the percentage of staff, that this study really did not look at a large percentage of the staff employed by Anne Arundel County Schools. And so if you add up all the staff of the people that are in these departments, it represented less than 3% of the total staff count. So we thought that was important. Now, that doesn't reflect the importance of these areas, but we did want to point out that it was less than 3% of the total staff. So the next slide talks about our approach. These studies are very data intensive. As Walt and the Anne Arundel staff knows, we asked for, I believe, 213 data items in yesteryear. That would have been equated to, probably tens of thousands of sheets of paper. But this took a lot of time to pull together, and we were very grateful, and we felt very prepared when we came on site that we had sufficient data to analyze before our site work. We also did benchmarking analysis, and the benchmarking was done with a peer group. We selected 5 peer school systems in Maryland to compare you with and on selected metrics and measures. And we also looked at the Council of Great City Schools annual report that collects information that's submitted voluntarily from urban school systems. And so those were used where applicable throughout the report. And then we also, there were other isolated instances where we just looked on other school system websites or other information that was publicly available to provide some benchmarking information. We conducted interviews and focus groups. We interviewed 68 individuals. We conducted 15 focus groups. The 68 individuals included a few from Anne Arundel County that we felt were important, even though the county was not included in the scope of work. And all of those names, focus groups, and individuals interviewed are listed in Appendix A of the report. We also observed board meetings for the last 2.5 years. We collected certain statistics on those meetings, and we observed meetings up to 2.5, 3 years ago, and also since the most recent election of the new board members. We came on site, corroborated the information from our site work, our preliminary analysis, other observations, and then we basically developed our findings and recommendations, which culminated in this final report. On the following pages, we put some of the summary analyses that we thought are important for the context of the study. And so the first few slides really address kind of global efficiency of Anne Arundel County schools. And this first slide shows general fund expenditures per student for AACPS and its peer school systems. And so a profile of these school systems is provided in Chapter 1 of the report. And this shows 2017-18, which is the most recent state financial data available at the time we were doing our work. But it shows a ranking of expenditures per student. And you'll see that Anne Arundel is ranked 5th highest out of the 6 school systems. On the next slide, you'll see a trend analysis of the same measure for Anne Arundel County. And so this reflects really moderate growth. It's a 6.4% increase over the 5-year period. And so these last 2 slides are kind of important, just contextual. You can't really draw conclusions from this benchmark data, but they are interesting observations in that we've had fairly flat expenditure growth, mostly due to flat funding, relatively flat funding. And then we also stack up pretty well against our peers in terms of spending per student. On the next slide, you'll see the student-staff ratio. And the student-staff ratio, you're all probably familiar with the pupil-teacher ratio. This is a similar ratio, except it looks at all staff relative to the student population. So it's total number of students divided by total number of staff. So the higher the number, the more staff efficient you are. Anne Arundel ranks the highest in terms of staffing, overall staffing efficiency. So this is also, you can't draw conclusions from this, but it is a good indicator. It also does not reflect the different degrees of contracting of certain services by the different school systems. And so this could explain some of the variance that exists. The next slide is a trend analysis. And this is, again, the same ratio, but looking at Anne Arundel County over the past 5 years. These are extremely flat. This basically says that the employee population has basically stayed the same over the 5-year period relative to its student population. So overall, we didn't see any big jumps in the number of staff relative to the student population. Again, that could have been likely constrained by funding limits, among other reasons. The next slide are the major themes that really came out of this study. and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about these before we get into the report. One, we found a very highly experienced and dedicated staff. This is probably not any news to you. There were several indicators of their experience. One, the number of years when we would interview the individuals, we would ask, how long have you been working in this area? How long have you been with Anne Arundel County Public Schools? And it seemed like the vast majority of individuals we met with had been here 20 plus years, 30 plus years. And we could tell and sense that there was a great working relationship among the people and among the departments. And that it was obvious, and probably even more obvious since COVID-19 hit, of how dedicated they are and committed to your mission. And so we felt it was an important theme that we have lots of recommendations in this report about process, but the discussion of efficiency is really more about process than about people. And so we wanted to commend your people and the dedication and experience of your staff. And then we'll have some suggestions for you on how to improve your processes. The second bullet really addresses the governance transition. This has been a challenging governance transition. We think a lot of these challenges can be addressed, and I will be going through some of those recommendations here shortly. The lack of operational and performance measurement and analysis, with the exception of one area, this was kind of a systemic problem in all of the areas that we looked at. And so we'll give you a little bit better sense of what we mean by this. But when we do a performance audit, we came in and we developed some performance measures for you and provided you a snapshot of that information. These are things that need to be internalized in your school system. We found many manual, paper-intensive processes that really resemble those of a generation ago. And this is due to pretty significant underutilization of technology. And this was across the board in all of the areas that we looked at. We also looked at your district level organizational structure, senior academic staff, and the other senior alignment. And organizations kind of have their own life. They change over time. They change when people change. And so over time, we've seen evidence of some misalignment that has occurred, and we believe that this is limiting long-term organizational equity, efficiency, and accountability. And so we're going to talk about how we evaluated your organization and some of the major. So the next slide, we can move on to the next slide after that. The transition was made more complicated by the state. The state basically drove the approach and the timetable. And so I think this would have been difficult under any circumstance, but we did not control a lot of the variables that drove this transition. We also, have a mix of appointed and elected board members, and that in and of itself made things challenging. We had new members taking the office in the middle of the year. In years past, the appointed board members generally took their office in the summer at the beginning of the school year. And so it was challenging to come in a week before the superintendent's budget of over $1 billion is put in your lap and basically said, welcome to our school system. Here's our budget. And so that was challenging. There's also a wide range of perceptions regarding what the board's role and responsibilities are. And that doesn't necessarily vary, we found, according to whether or not they are elected or appointed members. So that was an important context for the recommendations. These are the major recommendations for the board part of the governance. We'll talk about the administrative governance in a little bit. The first recommendation was to differentiate legal versus local board policies. And on page 2-5 of the report, there's a link in there to a school system, Fort Bend ISD's policy manual that gives you an example of what this looks like. And so when we were looking at your policies, there was no differentiation in the policy of which portion of a policy was driven by a legal requirement and which was driven by a local requirement. And we think this actually contributed to lengthy discussions in the policy committee meetings and in board meetings about the policies and modifying policies and approving policies. And so there are other states, including our home state, where these policies, the legal and local, are separated. And so the benefits of that is that the legal policies can be adopted en masse at one time because they're all legally required. And so those can be laid out, separately identified as whatever the policy name is, and show it in parentheses as legal. And those really don't need to be discussed because they're required by law. That would allow the school board then to focus on the local policies that you can influence, and that those can be separately identified as local policies. So we think this would be a lot more efficient way and less confusing, particularly for newer board members to come in and look at the policies to understand which portion of this is legally required and which portion is not. And so there's other implementation strategies that we'll talk about board policies, but this was the main thrust of it, was to separate these two to clarify and to be more efficient in how you update them. The second major recommendation is to establish board training requirements and strategy. Third, implement strategies to improve board meeting efficiency and effectiveness. We're going to talk about all these, so I'm just going to go over the high level now. Board workshops, public comment, parliamentary procedure, technology. These are all subcomponents of the board meeting efficiency analysis. And then the expansion of the internal audit program to basically be commensurate with its charter is our final recommendation. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see the kind of the remaining issues related to board policies that we're recommending. One is that currently the board policy committee spends time in their meetings on administrative regulations. There's really no need for this. In our opinion, the administrative regulations are developed by the superintendent. They can be, they only require superintendent approval. And as long as they're not in violation of any board, legal, or local policy, those are really the superintendent's job to establish those. And so the board policy committee is named the board policy committee, not the board policy and regulation committee. So we really think that it's unnecessary time for them to spend on administrative regulations. Second, the board handbook currently includes, and it's in the process of being updated, and we acknowledge that, but it also includes some of the board policies. And so we think that this handbook should be just guidelines. And if it's a policy, then let's put it in the policy manual. But if we put policies here, then we have to update this and cross-reference. And if these are guidelines that relate to the implementation of a specific policy, that's fine. But we should not need to repeat the policies in our handbook. These should be guidelines for the board. Third are specific references to legal policy citations in the text. Right now, if you look at a policy, at the very end of that policy, you see all the citations that relate to that policy, but you don't know which ones relate to which. And so in the current policy manual, you can't tell whether a portion of a policy is related to one of those citations or if it's a local policy. And so if you attach the citation to the actual policy or the portion of the policy that it's talking about, then it's very clear what exactly in your legal policy is coming from which law. and it'll be a lot easier for the reader to determine that. The last kind of implementation consideration is to indicate the date of the most recent policy review at the bottom of the policy, regardless of whether or not it was changed, just so you'll know that even though this policy was maybe last changed in 2005, that we look at it and we do a good job of looking, relooking or reviewing all of our policies now. And so it's important that we show that to future boards so that they know when we looked at it, whether or not we changed it. The next slide addresses board training. And the state has surprisingly very minimal training requirements. There's one course that's required. There's another course that's required, but only by one board member on the board. There are no locally established board training requirements. And as a result, we have a wide range of training among individual board members. And so there's no consistent tracking or reporting of board training hours. And so there's not an hours requirement, nor are there hours reported. We also don't have we haven't done a self-assessment in a while to inform board training needs. We think the board training should address both individual needs and desires, as well as looking at it more holistically at the board level to see what do we need as a board to be effectively trained as a board, and make sure that we have training representation among our staff at those sessions that are important to us at a board. So those are the major implementation considerations for the board training. The next several slides talk about board meetings. So this metric is, this graphic is in the report, and this shows the average number of hours and minutes of board meeting time before the election and after the election. And before you jump to any conclusions, there really are no conclusions you can draw from this other than that the average board meeting time went from 2 hours and 18 minutes prior to the election to 5 hours and 2 minutes after the election, more than double the amount of time. So somebody could look at this and say, well, it looks like, the board before didn't spend enough time governing. And it looks, someone could look at the board meetings since then and say, oh my gosh, you guys are so inefficient with your board meetings. They're taking way too long. Why is it taking so long? The answer, I think if you implement our recommendations, not just related to board governance, but other areas of the report, particularly as they relate to performance measurement, we think the ideal spot is somewhere in between. But we thought this was an interesting statistic to show just how much it varies. And you can see that there's some seasonal fluctuations for certain times of the year when certain events happen. But that the average was a pretty significant change before and after the elected board members came to office. Some of this, in my view, has to do with the training, half the board members being new. I mean, it's just there are a lot of challenges in addition to having both elected and appointed board members on the board at the same time. So the next slide talks about workshops. This is one of our recommendations, is to convert one of your first board meeting of the month into a board workshop that's really more of an agenda meeting. And this is a increasingly common practice. We believe it's a best practice where this is more of an informal discussion. You really don't even need strict adherence to parliamentary procedure in these meetings, but it allows kind of a more casual discussion between the board and the administration of items that are going to be put on the next meeting's agenda. And so this allows a lot of the discussion to take place and not need to be repeated at the board meeting. That would lead to a perhaps more efficient regular board meeting, the second meeting of the month. And so the conference room setting, which if we ever get back to a conference room or to our boardroom dais, these meetings, some boards do it in their boardroom, but they conduct these meetings around a table. And I think that you've had some experience doing that in other types of meetings. But this would be covering virtually all the agenda items that are going to be addressed in the subsequent board meeting, but done through in a less formal setting with no action items and no public comment, because there's no decisions being made. Obviously, we recommend it be open to the public, which I think would be required and also live streamed. The next slide talks about public comment. And we're very supportive of public comment. Public comment is important whether it relates to governance or not. We believe that the governance, and particularly board meetings, is really the board's time. And that when you look at how you're going to spend your time in a board meeting, that just about everything you do should add value to the governance process. These meetings are really the only times that you get to govern and make decisions in the public view. And so this time is precious. And so right now we have two different types of public input. One that can occur at the beginning of the meeting on any topic at all, and then they can also provide public input at the end or during the particular agenda items. So there's a couple problems with that in our view. One is that the public input at the beginning of the meeting may not be related to anything that the board is acting on. So it's really not supporting the governance process. Doesn't mean it's not important. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have other opportunities. You already do have other opportunities for public input, but you may want to have separate public forums throughout the year to have this type of public comment. But when you do it at each board meeting, it takes away from your other board meeting time of things that are adding value to your governance process. And so we're suggesting that you consolidate the public comment at the beginning of the board meeting and that it be limited to agenda items only. Not putting it at the agenda item is better. One, it's more convenient to the people that are providing the input. They don't have to stay for hours waiting for that agenda item to show up to appear on the meeting. And so they can provide their public comment, and then if they choose to leave, they can leave, but they don't have to wait. The second reason is that in a couple of instances, one specific one, we actually took a vote before on an agenda item, and then the public comments came after that. And so they were moot points at that point, but I think we felt bad that they came. We gave them all the opportunity to speak, but it did nothing to add any value to that agenda item because it was already voted on. And so we think that will really help by consolidating the comments up front and limiting to agenda items only. We really feel that that's going to help make your board meetings more efficient. Very risky. One, you may not have all the information, and if you make presentations without all the information, it just could create unnecessary risk for the school system. And so we should be appreciative of all the comments. We can thank them. We can invite the administration to follow up with them, but we should really stop at that. We should also seek representative comments. If we have 30, 40 people lined up that are going to speak about the same topic, and make the same point. We believe this happens at your state house, that you can manage that to say how many more people are going to come up and basically make the same point. And if 20 other hands go up and they say, well, we want to hear some different perspectives, and you can get some more representative comments of people not having to wait. Different school systems in Maryland do this differently. Some draw out of a hat. Some it's first come, first serve. Some limit the number of comments. You do not. We're not recommending that you limit them, but there might be ways that you could manage those. And so this is one of the ways we think that you could do that. And so we think if you need to ensure other opportunities for public comment unrelated to board meeting agenda items, you have the opportunity to do that. The next slide is parliamentary procedure. And I actually hired an attorney. I'm not an expert on Robert's Rules of Order. Your policy says that you're to follow Robert's Rules of Order. And so I hired an attorney to basically observe 2 of your board meetings, one before the election and one after the election. And since the election, I believe the one before the election, this information's in the report, I believe there were 5 violations in the meeting sample before the election. There were 16 after the election. The violations were not by 1 or 2. There were, I think, across the 2 meetings combined, there were 7 different board members that had violations. And this wasn't to pick on any individuals, is one to highlight the lack of training that's needed. But it also contributes to inefficient board meetings when we're always pausing to see if something's in order or not. And Robert's Rules of Order is a shared responsibility. It's something that everybody needs to take ownership for, and we need to follow them. And if we need to note the exceptions after the meeting, if there were things that we didn't consult with the board attorney with during the meeting, we should ask our board attorney to report back to us and say, where did we make mistakes, and how can we get better at this? The last major recommendation related to board meetings is the use of technology. Not all board members use the available technology tools that were offered to them, and we believe it's important that you do this. There is a strategic plan driving value number 3, which talks about efficiency and efficient processes. And we believe that needs to start at the board level. And if we need to reinforce that at the board level, that the board is committed to efficiency. Separate from that, you gain many benefits from using these tools in terms of search indices, just navigating through documents. Sometimes it's a difficult transition to go to an automated tool, but we've all had to do it in the past 20 years, and you do it in other parts of your life. It's something that would be good for the board, good for the school system. The next slide talks about internal audit. So the internal audit charter has some specific requirements of what their scope is, and significant financial, managerial, and operational information is accurate, reliable, and timely. That's one objective. 2, resources are acquired economically, used efficiently, and adequately protected. That's really aligned to this work. 3, programs, plans, and objectives are achieved. And this does not specify that it's just financial programs. It's basically speaks to all programs. So because of the policy requiring school activity fund audits, which is a good policy, we're not suggesting you change that at all. And I'm not sure that you could, but the majority of the effort of the internal audit department is now focused on that. And that may have been one reason you were not able to do this type of work internally, is you just don't have the capacity to do this broad range of work required by the scope for the school system. So we're recommending that you expand the scope of responsibility of the internal audit function to match the charter and really be in a position to add more value to the organization. And so we've included some implementation graphics, considerations, implementation dashboards, other things that can help you expand this and be more valuable to your organization. The next slides talk about the governance related to administrative governance. and wanted to also provide some contextual information here. This is administrative spending per student. Anne Arundel County and its peer school systems and state average. And the administration definition in the state pretty closely aligns with the scope of work. It appears to include HR, technology, financial management, and maybe a few other things, but it was the closest proxy we could find. And so Anne Arundel County is in the middle and right in line with the state average. And again, you can't really draw conclusions from this, but it is an important benchmark. On the next slide, you'll see the trend analysis of this same measure for Anne Arundel County. And again, this is really flat. We had an increase in 1 year, but declined in 17-18. And if you look at the net change from 13-14 to 17-18, it's been a very slow moderate growth and even declines in some years. It's important to note that on the peer, when you're looking at peer, particularly when you go down into these functional types of comparisons, that not all school systems code this expenditures the same way. They're supposed to, but depending on the way you're organized, some things might get coded differently. And so that could explain some of the variances among the different school systems. So I just wanted to point that out. But again, there's nothing alarming in looking at either one of these slides in terms of administrative spending per student. The next slide, we're going to talk about the organizational principles that were applied, and we analyzed the organization structure of all the areas that we looked at, and then in this chapter we looked at it at the district level. So these are the four major tenets of organizational analysis: logical alignment of functions, reasonable spans of control, which is the number of direct reports to that position, the differentiation of line and staff functions. Staff functions support the entire organization. Communications is a great example of a staff function. Legal services is a great example of a staff function. They support, they're usually smaller units relative to like a large operational area, but they support every different area. And in some cases, you need these functions to be independent of all the functional areas, particularly like in legal services. The last major tenet is the organizational leveling and equity. I think sometimes when organizational charts are drawn, people don't realize that people look at these. Your employees will look at these, and they're important to them because it shows their level. They'll look across that chart and see if another position with a similar title is a quarter of an inch above or below on that organizational chart, or if someone has a similar title. You'll get a sense of this when you look through the report, but it's important that the organization reflects organizational equity. And so we use this framework to basically analyze your organizational structures. So the assessment on the next slide, on page 2-29 of the report, you'll see your organizational chart at the district level, and you'll see numerical references and the descriptions below that of these and other observations that we made about your organizational chart. And so that should help you kind of see as well as read about the different areas where we had some things to talk about. You've got one example of a chief officer reporting to another chief officer. That's a organizational leveling issue, in that chief officer positions should all be on the same level. And you should never have any position, chief officer or otherwise, having the same position level report to another position of that same level. We also found several examples of illogical alignment of functions, human resources, professional growth and development, school security. We explained these in the report, but it's important to have functions logically aligned so that the person supervising them can be accountable for them. and that their job description includes skill sets that allow them to effectively oversee that function. So it's directly related to accountability. And so when you have a misalignment, it limits the ability of the position over that to effectively oversee that, those units. Span of control, the number of direct reports for our senior executives ranges from 2 to 7 positions. That's a wide range, and 2 is really too low. 7 is closer to what it should be, and there are some guidelines that you can apply, but at the senior level, you usually see 5 to 9 in the senior levels of the administration in terms of direct reports. When you get above that, it's just too much, and when you get below that, it creates opportunities or apparent opportunities for position consolidation. So there were a couple of undergraded positions in our views, human resources and finance. While these are relatively small areas in terms of operating budget and staff, these are 2 of the most important functions in any school system: money and people. And both of these units were kind of down in the organization as opposed to being visible to the organization. And as important as these functions are, they should be more visible to the superintendent and more visible to the board. And so we believe that these positions should be upgraded and be a direct report to the superintendent. We also saw that in one example, there was a subordinate position that had the same name, not level, but the same descriptive title. That again is something that organizational equity issue. We should never have someone that's a director over something and then someone be an assistant director over that same thing. There ought to be some differentiation in those job titles. The next slide talks about the organizational recommendations that we're making. Given the COVID-19, we're really suggesting that you consider these over the long term. Right now is probably not the best time. There may be some things that you can do sooner than later. Some of this may depend on attrition. But what we would like you to do is to set a long-term organizational target and then migrate to it over the next 3 years or so. And so there's several elements of this: the financial management, HR, and technology. Right now, technology is the chief officer reporting to the other chief officer. So that position doesn't need to be upgraded. It just needs to be elevated as a direct report to the superintendent. We think technology is also very important in that it should and does influence almost every decision now. And it needs to be, that needs to sit independently at the table when we're making those decisions. Delineation of staff functions, which I explained, eliminate the inequities, and establish a narrow range of span of control, not smaller span of control, but a narrower range. So within the 5 to 9 would be a more acceptable range of span of control for senior executives. The next slide expands on the recommendations related to senior academic staff. And so again, our scope of work did not include looking at any of your programs, how they're implemented in schools. And so it somewhat limited our ability to fully evaluate the quote governance of academic program management. But we were able to look at the senior staff organization and make some recommendations that we think will help improve the accountability and clarity of academic program management. So one is to consider consolidating instructional leadership. And so right now we have 2 positions that basically are over schools and over instruction plus other areas. And when you have a single individual over all academics, then you are less inclined to have differences between the C&I portion of what is being designed and the implementation of those programs by school oversight. We've seen in a lot of school systems where, and we've heard some evidence of this, not enough to independently justify the recommendation, but this is more of a emerging best practice, is to ensure the alignment of between what's happening in the schools and the program plans. And some of that may be decentralized to the schools, but for the things that are governed at the district level, that to better ensure alignment, having a single leadership position over that would help you do that. We also saw at the senior level and senior academic staff the unbalanced spans of control. One of the lowest positions was one of the academic leadership positions, had 2 direct reports, and that's low for even for a senior leadership position. So we think you ought to address the academic misalignments in student data. Right now, it's under Chief Operating Officer. It really should be under, the Chief Academic Officer or whatever the positions, the consolidated position is called. Compensatory education needs to be aligned under other academic programs. School and family partnership should be aligned under student services, and school security should be aligned under facilities because it's a much broader function and really relates a lot to the facilities issues. So those are our major recommendations for the senior academic staff. On the next slide, you'll see the proposed alignment. And I know this is probably small on your screen, but if you just focus on the blue boxes, we have the chief of staff out to the right of the superintendent. And then those 4 green boxes are really the staff functions that we think should align and report under the chief of staff. And that accomplishes the objective of separating that. The other 4 boxes represents chief academic officer, and the other 4 chief officers we've talked about, and the functions aligned under them. So I just wanted you to see that. We're not going to dig down into the details on that, but that's the proposed alignment that's in the report. 2 other recommendations really quick, but really important. One is to establish performance targets, specific performance targets and timetables for your strategic plan indicators. Right now, we have lots of descriptive, we mention a lot of these measures, but we say we're going to improve them, but we don't say we're going to improve them by how much over what period of time. And so we can't really be held accountable for growth if we're not setting our targets more specifically in terms of we expect to get to this level by this date. And then that helps you build up expectations for what you can do on an annual basis to basically get to that target. And so there's also some other observations about the performance information that's provided on your website that could be more complete. And then there's also a facet in your strategic plan that requires schools to select a subset of 2 to 5 indicators of all the indicators to report on that are the most important to them. Well, the risk of that is that they all might pick the same, and what about the other indicators? And how are we going to achieve our district level goals if we're not tracking all of those indicators? And we are in all of the schools, but we should be, maybe not with equal importance, but we should be reporting those as well, and not just those selected by the schools. The last governance recommendation is to implement a complaint tracking system. We don't have one right now. We think it's important to enter onto a system, the receipt of it, the referring of it to a department, how it was resolved, the date it was resolved, and confirmation that it was resolved, whether or not it was addressed or got the answer that the requester or complaint wanted, but at least we tracked it from the beginning through the end to make sure that we were responsive to the complaint and it wasn't ignored. We did not see any evidence of complaints being ignored. but we think this would be a good way just to provide accountability over this area. So I'm going to move on to financial management. We're, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through these other areas. I wanted to spend more time on governance for obvious reasons, but I'm going to go through the financial management areas. This is just a depiction of your revenue by source, which you already know. You're mostly funded by county and state funds. The next slide shows your total revenue per student for non-charter related revenue for you and your peer districts. This is all funds, not just general funds, but if you see the sequencing, it pretty much mirrors the general fund expenditures per student. We're 5th out of 6. Frederick was below us in both. And so, you can look at spending in a couple of ways, that the districts that spend more are less efficient, or you can look at it that the districts that spend more have more money. And so they can spend more, they can make more investments, smaller classes, higher teacher pay. And so that's why you can't really draw conclusions about efficiency from this data. On the next slide, we talk about kind of the major themes in the financial management areas. Again, the manual, paper, spreadsheet intensive processes, pretty much across the board, the underutilization of technology. We go into the specific processes in the report. We did identify some control weaknesses and some inefficiencies. Except for purchasing, none of the areas really had performance measures that could be used to hold themselves accountable. And as a result, we're spending a lot of time primarily because of our manual-based processes. We're spending more time on lower value add activities. And so we could be spending more time doing more analytical things than processing things. On the next slide, in the accounting reporting area, 75% of our disbursements are still made through hard copy check. That's kind of upside down. Some school systems, a lot of school systems your size, are that number is below 5%, or at least below 10%. So we need to be using more automation, not just in our work processes, but also in how we execute payments. We also have school staff making deposits manually. They're leaving the office, going to the bank, coming back. That takes out a chunk of their day. We should have someone coming around to pick up the deposits in a secured vehicle and making those deposits for us. That would be a better use of our staff time at the schools. In accounts payable, we compared you to a benchmark, and that's on the next page, where we showed your ratio of accounts payable cost per $1,000 or $100,000 of revenue. And Anne Arundel's in between the median and highest quartile of the Council of Great City Schools. So this kind of reinforces that we might have some inefficiencies that contribute to higher staffing demands. And so, again, you can't draw conclusions from this chart alone, but in cooperation with our data that we collected through looking at your processes, this was not surprising to us. On the next slide, we make recommendations to streamline the review and approval processes and thresholds. Right now, we have the same approval process regardless of the dollar size of transactions, and that's in a lot of different types of transactions. And that is a big burden on supervisors' time that is really unnecessary. Most school systems have staggered levels of authority to where below a certain dollar amount, it needs first level of approval. The second range needs another level up. By the time it gets to the chief financial officer, chief operating officer, you're looking only and approving only big ticket items. And so this system allows it to be the supervisors spend less time approving and rely on their subordinates to do that work. And so this was an area where we just think that's we're basically using dollars to chase pennies, and we don't think it's worth it. We're not saying sacrifice control. The review process needs to be in place. Just implement these dollar thresholds. The three-way match for approving payments, matching the invoice to the receiving report to the PO. Right now, the system requires us to match to the penny. We can reconfigure this to make it as big as we want. It doesn't need to be, we're not recommending a specific dollar amount. But again, we're spending time chasing penny differences when the system would actually allow us to set a threshold that we would tolerate a match, whether it's to the nearest dollar or what. Next is to improve the controls through segregation of duties. We have staff and accounts payable that has access to vendor data. That's a control weakness. You should not have someone who's involved in paying vendors with access to the vendor database that could actually set up a vendor. It creates an opportunity to pay a fictitious vendor. Again, we weren't doing an audit of that, but this control weakness certainly adds to that risk. We also observe separate administrative tasks. System administrative tasks were being performed inside the accounting function. There were the primary position and the backup position for system administration, giving users access to the system, were both in the accounting department. That's almost always handled by your information technology department, and so not the accounting department. And so we think those controls should be addressed. On the next slide, we talk about payroll. Payroll right now is aligned under HR. Payroll is not a human resource function, it's an accounting function. And similar to the accounts payable example I just made, you want to have the people that set up your employees' pay and all that information separate from the people who actually pay those people. And so sometimes it's done as a matter of convenience to align them under HR, but it is a control weakness, and we would recommend that you realign it under the financial management function, under the accounting function. There's also the timekeeping system. We desperately need an integrated timekeeping system. This eliminates the need for manual timesheets, automatically calculates overtime, strengthens internal controls. This is just something that is going to be challenging to implement. These systems are difficult, and but you're already keeping the manual timesheets. We just need to automate it. The next slide talks about employee reimbursements. Kind of the same thing. We need automated systems to allow for transaction level controls and improving internal control. And then these should also be done through payroll and done through their paycheck. Right now, we're doing paper reimbursement checks. And so we should be doing our payroll, which we do have a lot of the payroll checks, not accounts payable checks, being done through direct deposit. We should do our reimbursements through our payroll functions so that we can eliminate the manual checks. The next slide, we shift to budgeting. The lack of efficiency measurement is we found in each of the areas, and then when we looked into the budget process, we found it's really missing throughout the entire school system. And so we've got several recommendations about your budget. One is to incorporate efficiency measures into the budget, and so that you can actually see historically how efficient you've been, and then prospectively what you're budgeting in terms of a target for an efficiency measure. And so this would be much more meaningful, or it'd be meaningful in a different way than just the actual financial data and staffing data. This would actually show you how efficient you are and how efficient you've been over time. So we're recommending a 5-year trend. When you're looking at a budget, 2 years don't make a trend, 3 years really don't make a trend. And it's not until you see a 5-year trend where you can really see patterns emerge. And so even at a summary level, the information, the financial and staffing information that you get, plus these performance measures, would be very powerful information for the administration and for the board to see a much richer set of data when you're adopting the budget. We also think you should require board approval of the budget priorities at the beginning of the process. Right now, the superintendent requests input from the board on the priorities. Those are put in budget instructions pretty early on in the process, but those aren't necessarily the board priorities. And so because the board ultimately approves the budget, that we believe that the board priorities should be established and formalized before the budget process begins. That way everybody's on the same page. It could help eliminate or reduce some of the budget amendments. And so that was one of the recommendations in this section. The budget transfer process, similar to some of the other processes, is highly manual. We're printing things out in the budget office and executing budget transfers manually. So that needs to be changed, similar to the other processes. And then the last was to adopt a general fund balance policy. And we did not say necessarily a target. You may choose to develop a target, but something that guides your balance of what you want to hold and what the county council thinks you should have in terms of fund balance. And that number could have changed over the last 5 months. If you look at the next slide, you'll see a graphic showing the trend of your general fund balance over the past 5 years. And so it's bounced around quite a bit. And, you know, particularly with your stable spending base, we've had some things happen that have caused our general fund balance to go up and down. And so a general fund balance policy would just help us manage this. And it doesn't necessarily mean it'll eliminate the variations in the trend, but it would at least, we would be prepared if as long as we're consistent with that policy, then it wouldn't matter. We would be able to understand why that's the case. The budgeting recommendations are the next, I guess the next slide, we go into purchasing. So we spend 200 to 330 million a year in purchases based on the past several years average. It's our second highest expenditure after payroll. The purchasing department consistently receives a national award for your achievement of excellence. And it was the only area study that tracked performance measures. And so this was great. This was actually mentioned in your driving values, and which we think need to be broader to cover more areas, not just purchasing. But if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see what they tracked and how they stacked up against the standards by this award. And so I won't go through these, but these are all very good indicators of performance. And this is what each of your areas should be doing. Even without an award, there's benchmarks. Most of these measures are actually on the Council of Great City Schools data. And so you could use that as a resource, as well as perhaps other peer school systems that might want to collect the same measures. So this was good. We also looked at other measures in purchasing. Purchasing did have some of the efficiency issues as noted on the next slide. If we looked at the cost per purchase order. And so while there were many aspects of high performance in purchasing, purchase order efficiency in terms of processing was not one of those. This was not a measure that was part of the award, but we thought it was important for us to look at in this study. And you'll see that we're in between the median and the highest quartile on the Council of Great City Schools. Again, you can't draw conclusions from this, but when you corroborate that with the process analysis that we did, we actually start procurement as an automated process at the schools, where schools enter purchase requisitions into the system. But when they come to the central office, we actually print them out and process them manually. And so we've got the technology. We don't have to go buy technology to be able to automate a lot of this. We're just underutilizing the technology that we have. So our recommendations, if you go to the next slide, streamline the PO and the P card. Procurement card is a credit card process that has additional controls on it. You know, both of these processes are paper intensive. I've already talked about the PO process. The P card, all the attached documentation is submitted hard copy now. There are controls you can put in place to ensure that employees keep their hard copies, but they can photograph them and attach them to a transaction in the P card system. The next slide is risk management. We didn't have any recommendations for risk management. The risk management under the financial management, which was the scope of work that was assigned to us, this is really more of an insurance management function than a risk management function. And so virtually all insurance purchased through is purchased through and managed by Anne Arundel County. And this has been in place since the 1990s. And it's a great system. It's been working for you for a long time. I think it's good for the county. I think it's good for us. And, you know, we recommend continuing this approach. If some of your data had looked more out of whack, we might have said, you know, you need to look into this more. Organizationally, there have been some changes. The safety function was moved to facilities. Right now, there's only 2 FTEs in financial management, but for the insurance monitoring and the claims processing work that they do, that's probably sufficient. So we're not recommending any major changes on risk management. On the following slides, I did include a couple of performance trends. The next slide shows the Anne Arundel County insurance expenditures over the last 5 years. It's gone up and down, but it's shown a net decrease over the last 6 years. The biggest portion is workers' comp. And so we've done a pretty good job of managing our insurance expenditures. The next slide looks at workers' comp incurred claims. And so this has actually showed a decline in the claims incurred, not necessarily paid, but claims incurred over the past 4 years. So this did not sound the alarm bells to prompt a rethinking of using the county for virtually all of our insurance products. Okay, HR, I'm going to move on. We're close to an hour from when we started, and so I'm going to try to move through quickly. If you go to the next slide, you know, we have over 10,000 employees, 10,500 employees. This is the breakdown of them by type. We can move on to the next slide that shows some key staff ratios. Again, these are ratios of students to each of these staff categories. The higher the ratio, the more efficient we are. So you can see that we're either in line or above average, which is a good thing for almost all of these areas except for the secretary clerks. So if you look at the secretary clerk ratio, we're at 135. That's significantly below the LEA benchmark average. And we believe that while this is just one indicator, that we corroborate this with our process efficiency, just in the areas that we've looked at. We didn't look at all the different areas, other areas, but this variance indicates a potential $3 million a year of additional clerical staff demands that we have right now that could be due at least in part to our manually intensive processes. So this is something that it makes our recommendations worth exploring because we think there's a potential fiscal impact. We also think there's manual processes being done by non-secretarial and clerk positions based on our interviews. And so there may be other savings opportunities, but we would suggest reconstituting that effort to higher value activities by those positions. The next slide is to restructure the HR division. We want to elevate it, make it more important, and there's a lot of HR functions now that are not under HR. And Anne Arundel, position control, staffing allocations, employee recognition, professional development, leadership development. All of these should be under a typical HR function. And we think this would, aligning this and elevating this would make it more important organizationally to Anne Arundel. We think that's what needs to happen. Right now, it's more transaction focused and it's less strategic. And so a lot of our recommendations in HR really address that. On the next slide, we're recommending development of a long-term plan and strategy that incorporates performance goals and objectives. The strategic plan does really not adequately address human capital management in our mind, and we think that may be one reason that it doesn't have the measures, is that it does not receive the attention that it needs in the strategic plan. And so the performance indicators that I spoke about earlier are also applicable here. And in the departments, you will have, at the department level, you will have more indicators. Not all of those may need to go to the superintendent level or to the board, but there's a hierarchy of reporting that some are more needed at the lower levels and fewer, the really important ones are needed at the higher levels. Next is to standardize the position review. The next slide, please. I'm sorry. Streamline the position review and reclassification process. Right now, there's not really a process for submitting, for prioritizing or submitting reclassification requests, and there's not really budget set aside for this type of work. And so there's an inconsistent and manual process right now for reviewing and maintaining job descriptions. So we think that this, position review really needs to be much more structured and standardized because it's happening in different ways across the organization. The next slide speaks to other HR recommendations. One is a records management system to create digital files for all personnel records. Again, this is not new technology. We need to be moving towards to a digitized environment. The recruitment and retention plan, we need to enhance to consider other best practices, like a assessment of the positions and the recruitment sources for those positions. We listed several other implementation strategies for this plan, but again, we're not, it's not as strategic as we need it to be. It's more of a transactional approach, and we think a plan and specific action items that are commensurate with best practices will help. The onboarding process is also inconsistent across schools. And so this is something that needs to be standardized and streamlined. And we did receive during principal focus groups feedback about the variances in how employees were oriented at their school and onboarded. So this needs to be done with more fidelity, and this can be achieved through standardizing that process. Customer surveys, this is something that we think is a really important thing for HR and perhaps other areas to do. We're not sure what all other areas you might be doing customer surveys, but since human resources is such a big chunk of your budget, satisfaction of your users who use the HR department to expand the types of information you collect and look at it longitudinally so you can make judgments about this, and this could be a factor in performance evaluations. The next section and final section is information technology, and we have 90,000 computers almost in our school system that are technology function overseas. This is done by type. If you go to the next slide, we have a technology division that's very responsive to the organization. And I think this is, so there's high customer satisfaction with the technology department because anytime they're asked to do something, they step on it and they do it. They provide a very robust technology infrastructure. There have been recent investments in this infrastructure. But sometimes when the requests are coming from the departments, and we believe it's really the responsibility of the departments to have efficient processes. It's not your technology department's responsibility for your financial department or your HR department to be efficient. It's their responsibility, but they need to be asking for more advanced technology and using your technology department in perhaps a different way so that you can result in more efficient and more automated processes. So we think technology certainly needs to share in that responsibility and help push them towards more technologically advanced solutions. This led to one of our recommendations that we'll discuss in a minute. This unit has had no changes in staffing over the last 5 years. And so this is not an area that has been reduced, nor that it's been an area that has increased. So we've increased the investment in technology and equipment and infrastructure, but we have perhaps not made commensurate investments in staffing to achieve what we might need to achieve in terms of more efficient operations by providing more technologically robust solutions. The placement in the organizational structure right now, it's under the Chief Operating Officer. As I stated earlier, we believe this needs to be a direct report to the superintendent. We also believe it needs to be providing a more visionary role for the school system and how current and emerging technologies can help streamline processes. The recommendations in technology on the next slide. One is to create a project management office, and we actually think this needs to be created outside the technology department so that we have somewhat of an interface between the user departments and the technology office that will really help drive change in processing and how we find these technological solutions, and then help support the management of those solutions through their implementation. So the fact that we've seen all these manual paper-intensive processes and that we're kind of taking the easy way out of, if our software solution can't fix it, we'll call the technology department and we'll know they'll fix it or address our needs. And so we might need a separate unit, and even school systems that are fully automated have these offices that really help them manage these projects. Because these are major initiatives to re-engineer processes and substantially increase your automation. So the project management office is described in the report, and that's one of our recommendations. Another one is to develop a long-term plan, operational efficiency measures similar to the other areas. That's on the next slide, I'm sorry. Right now we don't have a long-term strategic plan in the technology division that aligns with the strategic plan. We think the strategic plan could speak more to technology, but like the other areas, there aren't any real measurable performance objectives for this area that we can use to hold it accountable. The next slide talks about reorganizing the technology division to provide a more logical alignment of function and improve service accountability. There were several functions that it really appeared that we had realigned staff to provide enough people to justify the position level for the senior position. Security was probably the best example of that. The entire system administration unit was under system security. Those are really not related functions. Those are usually separate functions in an organization in the school system. But, and there were other, in the business management was another example where there were other things aligned under this. And the reasons are really not important. but what it resulted in was an illogical alignment of functions, and it made it difficult for the person over that to be accountable for areas that were really not within their scope of responsibility or experience. If they were in their scope of responsibility, but not necessarily aligned with their experience. So we had several recommendations to realign the technology division. The next recommendation is to change, on the next slide, is to change the way you allocate your technology support staff to particularly to your elementary schools. This was basically the range of coverage by your half FTE assigned to each of your elementary schools. So you can see the range was from less than 400 technology devices to almost 1,400. And so we need to find a way to balance this out. And so instead of assigning a fixed amount to schools or based on enrollment, it needs to be based on the number of devices supported. And so this is one of the data points that supported that. The last recommendation on the next slide was to develop what's called a service level agreement for all technology services. And this will help establish expectations by the users of what, when they make a request to technology, that they're going to be ranked according to this type of framework or something like this, so that the red is obviously the highest risk and highest priority. Green is lower priority. And so this is important so that the users understand that when these get assigned to these different levels, that this is how the technology department is going to respond to these areas, that they're going to take care of the higher critical priorities first, which I imagine they've been doing a lot of the last 5 months. But this would establish this on an ongoing basis. So with that, I'll stop and pause and take a breath, and we'll invite any questions that you have. Ms. Corcadell, we did receive some through the Google spreadsheet. We don't know if you want us to address those first or if you want us to address those later. I'm going to ask someone on my team to actually read those questions if that's the approach that we're going to take, but I'll defer to you on how you want to handle questions.
Your proposal sounds appropriate. Thank you very much, Greg, and to your team. Very thorough presentation and greatly appreciated. I think that would make sense, that we go through, it doesn't have to be in particular order or order based on category, whatever you prefer, and feel free to go through those, and then at which time we're going to go in roll call order as it relates to the board members. So in the round robin that was described to them in the memo about the meeting tonight. So Greg, I'll turn the table back over to you.
Okay, Carrie, do you have the questions that we've been provided in advance?
Yep, I do. So there were 5 questions that were entered into that Google Docs worksheet, and they were all entered by Ms. Schalheim. So, but and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. So I'll just go through and I will read, I guess what I'll do, Greg, is I'll just read the question, and then the appropriate person in our team can provide the response if it's a question that's actually directed to the Gibson team versus a question that might need to be answered by somebody from administration. So the first question says, what is the low-hanging fruit in your estimation? What can reasonably be achieved in 2 years, 3 to 5 years?
The low-hanging fruit, my definition of low-hanging fruit is stuff that was easy to find, maybe not necessarily easy to implement. But I will answer your question. I mean, the short answer is the organizational changes, I don't think, are low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to make those changes immediately. So I think that the administration needs time to digest these recommendations and incorporate those into their long-term plan as to what they would recommend to the board as a long-term migration target and plan to approach that. The process reengineering, which is a big part of our report, takes time and takes an investment. And so the investment in software, the investment in requirements, definition, the process reengineering, you've been through these with other applications. They are time consuming, and you do not want to go through all software changes at one time. And so the staging of those, I would defer again to the administration on what would make the most sense in terms of staging that change. Some of the changes that we're recommending are just increasing the use of the systems you have. This is particularly true in purchasing as well as human resources, to where you just need to take advantage of the module that's there. And so that's low-hanging fruit. And so that's the stuff that can be done pretty quickly, because you're not having to buy anything. You're just having to turn the switch on and train people on how to use it. So you could get pretty far down the, again, I would redefine the processes and then see how these upgrades, or not upgrades, but system utilization could get you how far down the road to your optimal efficiency. Some of the other things like the control weaknesses could be addressed pretty quickly in terms of the segregation of duties. The performance measures could be addressed quickly. We provided some information that could help jumpstart that. The approval thresholds is something that could immediately provide staff relief in terms of the number of hours that they spend reviewing invoices, and you might want to phase that in, but those approvals would provide immediate relief to staff. And I'm just trying to think, are there any other major areas? I'm talking to my team about other areas that could be implemented more quickly than others. I think the board left out the governance. I think those could be done fairly quickly. I think it's important that you address those as soon as you can, because there's an upcoming election. It would be great to have most of these done by then, so that when your new members come on board, we're ready to go.
Much appreciated.
Carrie, you want to read? Did that address your question? Okay. Carrie, you want to read the second one?
Sure. Second question refers to a chart that was presented on page 4-22 of our report. And the question is, was the separation data by unit not collected or not provided to Gibson? And Greg, I can go ahead and answer that since it falls into the area of HR. So I will tell you that we requested 5 years of turnover statistics by department, by position. What we actually did receive was aggregated data, not at that level of detail. So we did receive actually the data, 5 years of the data that was shown in the chart. So summary of numbers and percentages, of turnover, summary of the number of positions that turned over and the percentage that number represented for each of the different bargaining units. And we received 5 years of that data. And I believe we just showed 1 year of that data in our report. Other turnover data that was also shown in our report, we were provided survey data from an exit rate survey. And again, that information from that survey was aggregated by bargaining unit. And that's where we showed just how folks responded to the survey that they received in terms of the reason codes and the reasons that they were separating from the school system. If that addresses the question, then I'll go ahead and read the next question, which refer, I'm sorry.
It does, thank you.
Okay, great. The next question refers to information on page 2-30, and it says number 3 that's in our report. And the question is this an observation or is there a recommendation associated with this bullet?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, Carrie?
So yeah, and I don't have the bullet in front of me, I apologize, but on page 2-30 of our report, and I believe it's bullet number 3. It says, is this an observation or is there a recommendation associated with this bullet?
Okay. The third bullet, I want to make sure there's 2 third bullets on page 2-30. So I want to make sure there's one at the top of the page which talks about potentially undergraded positions. And then there's one at the bottom of the page, the third bullet talks about separate identification and alignment of staff functions. Which one were you speaking to, if I'm on the right page?
Sir, it's the positions with lower spans of control bullet.
Oh, it's okay. It's the reference number 3, not the third bullet. Okay, that's why I was confused. Well, you'll see in our proposed alignment that we consolidate the academic leadership positions. So that addresses the most significant span of control issue. And the chief communications officer probably would not need to change unless there was depending on how the chief of staff position is filled, should you decide to separate the staff functions. So it would depend on how you deal with the chief of staff position as to whether or not the communications responsibilities or span of control would change. Carrie, you want to go to the next one?
Yep, let me move on to the next one. Referring to per pupil revenue on pages 3-3 and 3-4, why did the per pupil spending decrease in 1920 from 1819? And then there's a comment that also says this question is likely for AACPS staff.
I'll just point out, Greg, if I could just intervene here, we're not entertaining any questions that would be directed to staff. Staff is not going to be addressing any questions. And the board, I was going to say this at the end of the meeting, but I might as well, I guess, before our questions are addressed, that we're going to establish a process, because as we all know, we are in the process of reopening for the fall. And so we're going to need to make considerations as to what our next steps are. And part of that will be, now that we have the report for your board leadership, with myself and Melissa, to get with Walt and develop a strategy so we can make sure all the needs are met and that we're being responsible and responsive and taking the maximum amount of benefit we can from this. So it's okay if you end up asking the question, but I'll just ask the members to please appreciate if they're not able to. That'll be something we'll be taking on at a later moment in time.
Understood.
You guys may proceed.
Thank you.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and read the last question, and I'm not sure who should address this question either. The audit contains several recommendations focused on realigning organizational charts, which may include renaming various positions. The board has always been told that we need to get approval for positions regardless if funding is requested to support those positions. The county council was informed during the last budget cycle that they, quote, don't have AACPS position control, unquote. These statements seem contradictory to me. If we are seeking to implement the various organizational chart recommendations, is it really mandatory that we seek approval for a position to be retitled, even if we are utilizing funds from within the same budget category?
And I understand that that's not going to be
Yeah.
answered tonight. And I just thank you so much, Gibson, for answering my other questions and for this report and for your work. And I'm very grateful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys, for it. Okay, we're now going to start our live questions in the round robin based on our presentation. and any questions that may have emerged or comments that members may want to make. So we're going to start with Miss Ellis tonight. Miss Ellis. And just a reminder, just before I totally turn it over to Miss Ellis, I'd be remiss. The board members were asked to keep to 2 questions per round so that we can be respectful and ensure that all members have an opportunity and can also be respectful of some of our time constraints that we have for this evening's workshop, and recognizing that there may be some additional opportunities for us to do further reach out should it be necessary. And we can work on coordinating that after the conclusion of the workshop. So, Ms. Ellis, you may begin.
Thank you, President Corkadell, and thank you for clarifying that. Of course, I have lots of questions. There's a lot of detailed information in here, and while I see it as a roadmap, feel like yeah, there's a lot of clarification to get, but hopefully my colleagues will be asking some of these questions too. So one of the things I guess most important to me to ask about is your recommendation that that the board has a budget workshop and that we collaborate with our superintendent and even with the county to build the board's priorities into the board's budget, which is different than the process we have now. I think it's a great recommendation, something that the budget committee has talked about numerous times now. Do you have examples of other school systems and how they successfully approach this?
I do. I can point you to some that there's not any really visible evidence other than the board priorities that come out of that. But it's usually initiated by superintendent, I think as it is now. And then input is sought like it is now. But before the budget process starts, there's an approval process and so
right.
It's really a simple matter of getting the majority of the board to agree on the board priorities so that everybody's acting in sync when they're developing the budgets. So that when that budget comes back to the board in the subsequent, well, in December, and then for approval in the following year after the public hearings, that it should be aligned. You've got a much better chance of that budget being aligned to the priorities you established. Otherwise, we're all still working on different board member priorities and trying to resolve those 6 months later.
Right, and I thoroughly agree with that advice. If you are able to provide, even just steer us to another couple of school systems, I just like to see their timeline and their process to help us sort of map something out for our probably work this through our budget committee and propose something to our board.
Okay, I'll be glad to do that.
Wonderful, thank you. And then can you talk a little bit more about your recommendation for a fund balance policy? One thing that's always been confusing to me is we have a targeted fund balance. I believe it's around 13 million. And so every year that fund balance gets built into our budget. And so when you look at the budget, the projected revenue and expenditures, we don't end up with a fund balance each year in the projected budget. But at the end of the year, it's assumed that we are going to have a fund balance. In other words, we're building the entire fund balance into the budget as if we're going to spend it, knowing that we're not going to spend it. So I'm a little confused by that. Do you? I don't know how closely you looked at our budget and.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the reason. One of the reasons, and Dr. Arlotto may want to speak to this also, but every budget is built based on no vacancies. you build a budget for all the positions that you need, and then throughout the year, you're gonna have vacancies. You have a 10% vacancy rate, which is really pretty low. That's your turnover rate. Your vacancy rate, at one point in time, I don't know if we have that data. But anyhow, you're gonna spend less than what you budgeted on staff just because you're gonna have people leave, you're not gonna be able to fill the positions. So that's why you're able to basically budget more and draw on fund balance, knowing that at the end of the year, you're gonna be okay because your actual fund balance is gonna be fine because you're not gonna spend all the money you budgeted. And so the fund balance policy we're recommending is the actual fund balance policy, not your budgeted balance.
Okay.
And so the fund balance is what shows up on your balance sheet in your financial statements at the end of the year. So it's not what's included as your deficit spending or your fund balance spending. That's different than your end of year fund balance that's on your balance sheet.
So if I understand correctly, do you think that our budgeting, our accounting in the budget up front, in other words, is that a normal practice for us to build the entire fund balance into our budget?
I don't know if you should build the entire fund balance. Again, I don't know what you don't have a target for what your fund balance should be. And it varies from state to state. In Texas, it's like 3 months of operating expenditures. It's a big number. In Florida, it's 2% of your operating expenditures.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a county government backing you up, that's basically providing a lot of your funding, they probably should be involved in the discussion of what should you have as your fund balance target, whether it's a percentage. Probably shouldn't be an absolute dollar amount. It should be their percentage of operating expenditures and to basically determine why you need those levels. Because when you accumulate too much, the legislature and taxpayers look at you like you're stockpiling money. If you don't have enough, then things like pandemics and other things happen where you're caught short. So it's very important, and more important now than it was 5 months ago, that you at least talk about this, even if you don't identify a specific percentage, that you might have a range of acceptable percentages of end of year fund balance.
Okay, I'm going to ask the same thing, if it's possible to see any examples of like a policy like that. That would be very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ellis. I'm going to see if Mr. Grannon has had a chance to join us yet. Not seeing that to be the case. If he is able to join us later on, we'll try to jump him in for a few questions. Ms. Schalheim, you are next.
I am going to yield my time since I already asked some questions via the spreadsheet. I just wanted to say once again how grateful I am for all of this wonderful information. So again, publicly, thank you for your hard work, especially during a pandemic. Much appreciated. And I'll yield to Ms. Antwine.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schalheim. It's greatly appreciated in the interest that we did have a couple of minutes of start time and a little more detailed explanation in our presentation, both of that of great value. Ms. Antwine?
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Schalheim, for the consideration. I have several questions as well, but in consideration of the 2-question limit, I wanted to ask a clarifying question first. Earlier in the beginning of your presentation, you said that you were able to observe the processes of only about 3% of our staff. Was that true? Is that what I understood?
The 3% only was information that spoke to the scope of our work that you asked us to look at involved 3% of your staff.
Oh, got it. So based on the scope itself narrowed the observation footprint.
Yes. We spoke to 66 individuals in the 3 departments and the board. So we visited with a lot of people, a much higher percentage of the departments than 3%. The 3% just is what the scope of work dictated, and that's the total number of employees. If you add them all up in all of these areas and divide it by the total number of employees in the entire district, it was less than 3%.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, because that helps to shape the 2 questions that I had formulated. So there was a lot of emphasis on the manual processes that we still have in place in our system, and trying to modernize those processes for more digital emphasis. Was there overarching cost analysis that was conducted to tell us just how much that would cost us, realizing that this would be a major change management process, especially with our staff being on for so long doing it that way. But it is definitely necessary as we move more virtually in our processes, our performances, and our school environment. So the question would be about the cost analysis. Was any of that done so that we can understand just about how much on average it would cost us to make these kinds of changes?
We simply don't have enough information to make estimates of cost. One of the reasons is that a lot of the functionality that needs to be automated, you already have the automation. We're just not using it. And so
okay,
you may not need to buy new software in some cases. All you need to do is turn it on and you train people how to use it. So until you do that, we won't know what the gaps are in terms of what your automation needs are that you can't fill by better utilizing the software that you already have. Once you identify the gaps at that time, then you'll be able to say, okay, we need this module, we need this software, and then you can start to explore the cost of the software and the cost of implementation. But it's all going to be driven by your requirements. And so the requirements that would need to be developed by each of the departments as to what do they want this system to be able to do, and what are the functional and performance requirements of the system. So those will also drive your cost.
Thank you. That makes perfect sense. So, and you said that earlier in your presentation as well. Hey, look at what you have already and utilize that first. So thank you for that. Then you all were here at the height of COVID. And first, thank you sincerely for being there. Literally, in terms of frontline work, you guys were there doing that. So thank you for that. Major adjustments in terms of our performance of our processes had to be made because of COVID. Do you think that may have influenced some of the observations that you shared tonight?
That's a really good question. I think it influenced the timing of implementation of recommendations, particularly as it relates to like the general fund balance. That may change just because of your financial situation. Then if we had made this recommendation 6 months ago, it might not have been a high priority. Now it might be a higher priority. I really don't know what your actual fund balance is, but most of our field work was done, and a lot of our data analysis was done prior to COVID and during the week of COVID. And so the full effects of COVID, when it started more affecting your operations, we're in the later stages of the project. So I don't think it would have changed our recommendations really at all for the areas that we were looking at. I think it may change the urgency or non-urgency of implementation.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And this was an incredible report and an incredible presentation. Thank you very much. That's all for me, President Corkdale.
Thank you very much, Ms. Antwine. Next is Mr. Gilliland. Mr. Gilliland.
Thank you, Madam President. I've got no questions or comments except to say thank you for providing what I believe is a very comprehensive report.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gilliland. Mr. Leib?
Thank you, Madam President. I echo Mr. Gilliland's comments, and all of us, the board. I think this is a very thorough report Gibson's performed. And having been through many audits in my public service career, I'd like to compliment the tone of the performance audit that we've heard tonight. And by that, I mean, your tone has been one, how sometimes audits, play the gotcha role. And your tone is one on what you believe we can do to really perform better as a school system in the areas that you looked at. And for that, I am very appreciative. Your perceptions, I thought, were insightful. Your recommendations for our consideration will cause us all to do some examinations of thoughts and processes from the past. But I don't have any further questions. I'd like to thank you, though, for quite a professionally well done performance audit. And I wish all audits were in this vein in public service, and so often they're not. So again, thank you for a job well done.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Leib. I very much appreciate them, as we all do, on behalf of our team.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Leib. Ms. Hummer?
Yes, I want to echo. I thought that there's lots of good suggestions, good food for thought in there, some of which we as a board, it falls directly on us and our purview to look at making ourselves more efficient and more in line with the school system goals. And then there's some others that will be for the superintendent and his team to consider. I wanted to ask you, as you look at this, you've worked with 150 different school systems. Where do we fall in that? Do you, based on this, there's always going to be recommendations, but I mean, are we a hot mess compared to other places, or are we a solid team that can just improve what we're going to have?
If I may be candid, from a governance standpoint, I've never seen a situation like this. We've seen school boards go from at large to single member districts. We've seen other types of transitional things with boards. I've been doing this a long time. I've not seen a governance challenge like the one you're facing right now. So I think it's, I don't know if I'd categorize it as a hot mess, but I think it's been really difficult, and I don't think in hindsight, it's difficult to judge that, well, we should have done this, we should have done that. Until you go through that, you didn't really know what this was going to look like. And so, but I'm hopeful that these recommendations will help you and help future boards, be more proactive in any kind of change that comes your way, that you're able to deal with it better, because it was tough, and you are not in control of the variables that made this happen. And so I think there's the challenges that you faced and the recommendations that we made, I think are going to help. So the governance, it's just been a very challenging situation. And so I would put that in one category. In terms of the operational areas, I don't think I've ever said to a client that they've been a generation behind in their work processes. And sometimes they underutilize technology, but I was really surprised that there's really almost an aversion to technology. In fact, I heard that term in a couple of interviews, that, it's risk averse, technologically averse. It's easier to just continue with the way we've been doing things. We have good people, and these good people are doing good work with the current processes. Why change? And I think that's what we've kind of carried with us. And I think that as you have either turnover or retirements of these people, I think that's when you're going to feel the pain of not staying up with the automation and efficiency. Is that people are going to come in, and new people are going to come in and be going backwards in their career in terms of work processes, and so that may affect your future turnover. So I was actually surprised. We've been to other systems larger than yours that were much less efficient, had many more cost savings opportunities. I won't mention names, but a lot of these reports are in public view. And so our comment is more about process efficiency, but not about spending and efficiency, because there's no indicators that show that you're just wasting money, wasting staff, your overall staff ratios and your overall spending levels. Based on the global metrics we looked at, nothing really looks out of kilter. But the only other thing that I was really surprised to see was the degree to which we had manual processes, even for those processes that started off being electronic. That was really kind of the biggest surprise.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Hummer. Mr. Smith?
Good evening, Mr. Gibson. I just have one question. I think you may have touched on it a little bit when you answered Ms. Antoine's question. You said you can't make a cost estimate, but could you possibly make a savings estimate if we implement all your recommendations?
The benchmark that I provided on the clerical staff, where we have, relative to our other school systems, we have about 100 more clerical staff positions than our peers. So that would be in the range of, $3 million a year. And so that is not necessarily a fiscal impact, but it is a relevant measure that when we re-engineer our work and we redefine our job descriptions, we shouldn't need as many clerical people if we don't have as many clerical tasks. And then for those that are non-clerical positions that are doing manual tasks, that could be repurposed into more value-added tasks, like cost analysis. You could be doing your own cost analysis. Your budget folks right now working really hard, doing a great job, but they're processing transactions and helping departments get their budgets done. They don't have time for budget analysis or cost analysis, the kinds of things that you would see them do. And so by freeing them up from some of their manual work, by making that more efficient, they would be able to do higher level work that would be more valuable to the budget process.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Gibson. And as you can probably imagine, this is my first audit experience. So, Gibson, you really set the bar high, and I just want to thank you for a phenomenal, very comprehensive job.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments. And welcome to the board, by the way. It's my first opportunity to meet you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And I'm the last, but I will I've already iterated appreciation and how I feel about this. This is something that has always been on my mind before I came onto the board, that I'm a firm believer in self-evaluation and in having also outside eyes for the blinders that naturally occur with people in self-evaluation. And so I think this is just another tool. This is going to be definitely a tool in the toolbox that we can further utilize. And I think under our current crisis that we're experiencing, that there are principles that we can start building into, even if we cannot ensure direct acquisition or adoption of some of the recommendations. So I look forward to the upcoming years and seeing some of these things come to fruition and perhaps even spark opportunities in other aspects and components as we move forward. I do not have any questions for you at this time. I found the information very thorough, and if I do have any, I will definitely be reaching back. At this point, I know there are several members, but not necessarily all, that may have additional questions. We do have a few minutes remaining to do a second round. So I'm going to omit those who did not have questions. And of course, if that changes, they can raise their hand or give a shout out. But out of efficiency, I'm going to narrow the field a little bit here on the roll call order, starting again with Ms. Ellis. Did you have further questions you would like to address this evening?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So if you could just talk a little bit about, so you indicated you don't think we are overly staffed, but if you were to combine both the, I guess, implementing the technology to create greater automation, and also I was looking at your recommendations for reorganization, it seemed to me that the reorganization provides some opportunities for some streamlining. And then again, the automation, greater automation seems to me would realize savings in manpower. So those are both potentially staff impacts and cost savings. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. The staff savings, the easiest staff savings to identify relates to all clerical staff, not just the clerical staff in these departments.
Got it.
So that creates, I mean, that's the opportunity for, LEA-wide savings opportunities for clerical staff. So within the departments, there are several metrics in the report that show where we're above the median, we're in the highest quartile compared to Council of Great City Schools. And you could basically back into, or we can help you back into a number. But again, we want to see how much of the savings could be redirected to higher value activities before we just say this is a savings and we can eliminate a position. So if someone's a clerical staff performing a clerical function because we have a manual process and we automate that process and we don't need that position, that's a savings. But if we have if we have a professional staff person that is performing manual processes or spending an inordinate amount of time approving transactions that they shouldn't be approving, that's going to free up their time to do higher value things that we also think need to be happening. So you can look at that overly simplistically in our view and say, oh, well, we don't need as many supervisors. You would say, reconstitute the work, make sure you're doing the work that needs to be done in these areas, technology, financial management, HR, make sure that we're doing the highest value work that we need to be doing before we make staff cuts, at least in the professional staff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And then finally, you talked about our internal auditor and the fact that basically his time and his staff is basically used for these biannual audits of our schools. And I don't know legally what can be done. That's something we'll have to look at in our school district, I guess, or in our state. But doesn't it make sense for that to be a school system and operations function? Because I know that Dr. Arlotto and his team would want his schools to be spending efficiently and have proper accounting. And so it seems to me that the board's internal auditor should be doing these broader projects as you suggested we're missing out on. So could that fall, in other words, should that be a board function or a school system function to be auditing the accounting of the individual schools?
We've seen it done both ways. And you're talking about the school level, we're talking about school activity funds.
Right.
Not general fund spending at the schools. We're talking about student activity funds.
Correct.
There may be other things that are within the scope of Walt's purview that extends beyond activity funds, but I know the activity funds are things that are required by policy. So some school systems use their internal audit capacity to do both. Others have a unit that actually reports to the administration. They're not called internal audit, but they do exactly what Walt's department is doing. So that would be a board decision on how it wants to do that. It's an important function that's required by policy. How you align that function, since it reports to you, is really up to you. We've seen it done. We've seen it done both ways.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ellis. Let me just double check and make sure Mr. Grannon was in a late check-in. I'm not seeing him in my people list or a telephone number similarly. Ms. Schalheim, did you have any further questions? I know you originally deferred, but I'm wondering if you had any additional ones that have emerged.
I was going to ask the one that Ms. Ellis just asked. So our charter as it's laid out doesn't specify that the internal auditor specifically performed those school-based audits. Is that an accurate statement?
I would have to go back and look at it, or Walt might be able to answer that. But I listed the things in the report from the charter that speak to a broader scope. But since it's required by policy, I imagine that if it's not in the charter, I would think that it is in the charter. Kent, do you remember? Walt, can you help us here?
I do believe it's in the charter, along with, as Greg said, a broad range of other types of activities that would be included in internal audits. So the other projects that you're talking about, we do include some of those in our annual audit plan, but obviously our time's limited, given the fact that we have to share it with doing the school activity funds audits. So the charter does address both types of audits being performed through my office.
Oh, it does. So we would have to adjust the charter to be able to broaden the responsibility with the existing resources we have in terms of people power. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, I would say it's pretty broad as it stands, but obviously we could revise the charter anytime we want to. So I don't think it's a difficult process to go through to revise the charter. But again, I think it addresses the other projects that I think you are all alluding to.
Yeah. So that was part of what I was going to ask as well. So I think it's been answered. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schalheim. Ms. Antwine, did you have any further questions for Gibson Consulting?
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Gilliland, seeing no action, further action, and Mr. Leib, not seeing further action. Ms. Hummer, any additional questions?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
None.
Okay. And then just lastly, any last call? Ms. Ellis? Anything further?
No, thank you.
Okay. Ms. Schalheim, anything further?
No, thank you. Thanks for everything.
Okay. Well, I gotta say, we are definitely ending on a time efficient note. Getting done on time, isn't that ironic? I think, and definitely, maybe, hopefully, a foresight into much better days, and I am confident. I know all of our members care deeply about doing our best job, and so we definitely have greater insight to that. As I had stated, I want to thank everyone once again for their participation and listening in. I know the staff is very busy, and several of them did have time to join us virtually, although albeit silently, in this workshop. And of course, they'll have an opportunity to review it at their convenience, those who were not able to attend. We will be, just as I had alluded to a little bit before we started the questions, will be, the board members can expect to receive in the coming week or so additional information of what our next step is, and then what that means as far as our interface with staff as it relates to the audit. So please stay tuned for additional information on that as we roll forward. Dr. Alato had joined us and was able to stay the entire time. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Alato, did you have any closing comments or any comments to Gibson or to the board before we close out? Nothing.
Thank you, Ms. Corfield. Thank you, members of the board. I'm appreciate the time and energies, both on the board and moving forward with this project and funding this project. As has been said throughout the evening, throughout the process, another set of eyes, and in this case, multiple sets of eyes, taking a good, clear look at us can only make us better. So we're appreciative of the information.
Thank you very much. Okay, on that closing note,
Ms. President Porkadell, I'm sorry.
Yes, Ms. Ellis.
Can we, do we have a date that the actual written report will be available for the public?
Yeah, I was going to defer back over to Gibson and Walt, because Walt will be managing the final. And just as a general reminder to everyone, this is a draft because it is an interactive report that has now been presented. And I will defer over to Walt and Greg as to details of that, but I know they'll be working very hard to provide that to us. And of course, we have members of our delegation and others I know are going to have interest in that. And I have a coordinated administrative details of that on behalf of the board with Ms. Howell and Ms. Money to make sure that we are respectful of those who funded this and I know of our state, who we really are responsible to, even more so, having great interest in reviewing it and helping, hopefully supporting our efforts in embracing some of the recommendations and determining what would that best approach will be. So that'll be addressed and probably indicated in the memo as to what that's going to be looking like. So without further, I'm going to turn this back over to Walt, and then I'm going to close out with Gibson here. Walt, any closing comments or additional information on what the board can expect in the coming weeks in general as we work through?
My understanding from Carrie is that she will finalize the report this evening, and I will be able to download it tomorrow morning. My intent is, as soon as I get it, to email it out to the board members and Dr. Alato and his executive team tomorrow morning as soon as I get it. And at that point, it will be in final form and available for public inspection, as I understand it. That's my understanding. If I'm inaccurate about any part of that, Greg obviously can correct me, but that's my understanding from Carrie.
Mrs. Corkadell, as soon as we receive it from Walt, we'll post it to the website.
Okay, that sounds good. And I believe we will also have, a summarized statement to go along to coordinate all of that. Those will be administrative details we can work through first thing tomorrow morning. I'll make sure that I'm available, and we'll get with the board's administrative staff on coordinating that and making sure that we're getting everything out publicly appropriate. Okay. Greg, anything else? Yeah.
Walt's description is correct. We are also, while we're delivering our report tomorrow in the morning, that we're going to be available for questions. If additional questions come up, you're going to need time to digest this, I would imagine. And so we will be around if you need to reach out to us with questions, whether you want to use the Google protocol that you're using now. That would be fine, because we understand that this could go on for a little while, and we're not just going to run off now that we're done with this presentation. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Arlotto for committing his staff during probably one of the more difficult weeks, although I think you've had a lot of difficult weeks since that time. But after Wednesday, March 11th, your staff was trying to do many more important things than meet with consultants. And so we appreciate you letting us finish our work and committing your staff to conducting the follow-up work that we needed to with them. And it was just a pleasure working with you on this audit. So thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Just to clarify, board, we will be using our normal approach to address questions and answers. So as that information can come in, all members of the board can see it. Reduces, speaking of efficiencies, I like those logs, those shares, because it allows us to eliminate and reduce duplicative questions, and betters the overall board information, because we know that oftentimes, you may not have thought of that question, but having that answer is definitely beneficial. So thank you guys very much. And we'll share with the board more details about, the practical approach of how to get that additional information from Gibson as we move on. We don't need to address that tonight. Thank everybody once again. And this does conclude our workshop, unless there are any final comments. Our Vice President, Ms. Ellis, did you have any closing remarks you would like to make as my partner in crime here on the team?
Thank you for the opportunity. I just want to say how delighted I am with the thoroughness and efficiency of this whole process. Thank you, Gibson. Thank you, Walt. Thank you, Dr. Arlotto and your team. I'm very, very pleased. Great. Thank you very much. Everyone, this meeting is now concluded, so we're going to close out our public portion of this, and you can leave the call at your leisure. Thank you very much.